The Great Flood Before Noah, Mesopotamia, Memory and Myth, Part 1. The story does not begin on a mountain, it begins with clay. A broken clay tablet, baked hard by time, covered in wedge-shaped marks, excavated from the ruins of Nineveh and eventually read in the British Museum. When 19th century scholars began to understand the tablet, they recognized something startling. Here was a flood story from ancient Mesopotamia, written in cuneiform, with details that sounded strangely familiar. A divine decision, a warning to one survivor, a great boat, animals, storm, birds, sacrifice, and life after the waters. For readers raised with the story of Noah in Genesis, this was not a small discovery. It did not prove that Genesis was false. It did not prove that archaeology had found Noah's Ark. It did something more historically interesting. It showed that the biblical flood story belonged to a much older Near Eastern world of flood traditions, scribal memory, and literary transformation. The careful question is not who copied whom, as if ancient literature were a school assignment. The better question is what happened to flood memory as it moved through Mesopotamian languages, tablets, temples, scribal schools, kingdoms, and religious imagination. Long before the familiar biblical form, Mesopotamian scribes were telling stories about a flood that nearly ended human life. The names changed. In one Sumerian tradition, the survivor is Zi-ud-sura. In the Akkadian Atra-hasis epic, he is Atra-hasis, whose name means something like exceedingly wise. In the Gilgamesh tradition, he is Utnapishtim, the distant survivor whom Gilgamesh seeks after the death of Enkidu. In Genesis, he is Noah. These figures are not identical. Their stories do not mean exactly the same thing, but the family resemblance is real. To understand why flood stories mattered so deeply in Mesopotamia, we have to begin with the landscape. Southern Mesopotamia was river country. The Tigris and Euphrates were not scenery, they were the basis of agriculture, transport, settlement, and political life. Water made fields possible, canals extended order into the alluvial plain, irrigation allowed cities to grow, but the same water that sustained life could also overwhelm it. A river civilization does not think about water abstractly. Water is labor. Water is food, water is boundary, water is danger. In that world, a flood story was not merely a fantasy of destruction, it was an enlarged form of a familiar truth. Human order depends on forces it cannot fully control. The Atra-hasis epic begins far from the version many people know. Before the flood, before the boat, before the storm, the gods themselves are working. In the story, the lesser gods bear exhausting labor. They dig canals. They maintain the ordered world. Eventually, the burden becomes unbearable. The gods rebel. The solution is the creation of human beings who will take up the work the gods no longer want to do. This is a very different beginning from Genesis. Human beings are created not first as the crown of a moral cosmos, but as workers in a divine economy. They exist to relieve divine labor. The canals, the fields, the structured world of Mesopotamian society are imagined back into the realm of the gods. Then humanity multiplies, and humanity becomes noisy. That word, noise, is easy to misunderstand. It can sound almost comic, as if the gods are irritated neighbors. But in the epic, the noise signals disorder, overpopulation, unrest, or a disturbance of cosmic balance. Human life has become too much for the divine order that created it. Enlil, the powerful god offended by the noise, seeks to reduce or destroy humanity. Plagues and disasters appear in some versions. Finally, the decision becomes flood. But another god, Enki, or Ea in Akkaditional tradition, does not want humanity erased. Bound by divine politics, he warns Atra-hasis indirectly. The famous motif is the wall or reed wall. The god speaks not openly to the man, but through the structure beside him. The message, in essence, is to leave possessions behind, build a boat, and preserve life. That moment is one of the great turning points in ancient literature. The flood is coming, but knowledge arrives in time. Atra-hasis builds. He brings family, he brings animals. The storm arrives, the waters rise, the world disappears into weather. In Mesopotamian versions, the flood often lasts 7 days and 7 nights. The gods themselves can be frightened by what they have unleashed. Afterward, when the survivor offers sacrifice, the gods gather around the offering with hunger. This detail is deeply revealing. The gods tried to destroy human beings, but the world without humans is not simply better. The relationship between gods and humans, labor and offering, noise and order, has to be renegotiated. The Atra-hasis epic does not end with a covenant in the Genesis sense. It moves toward population-limiting measures, toward a new balance after catastrophe. That is why Atra-hasis should not be treated as just an earlier Noah. It has its own theology, its own social imagination, its own anxieties. It is about divine labor, human multiplication, noise, survival, and the management of life after near destruction. Another flood tradition survives in Sumerian, but only fragmentarily. The Sumerian flood story, associated with Zi-ud-sura, is damaged, with gaps that resist our desire for a smooth narrative. That brokenness is important. We are not reading a modern novel. We are reading what time has left behind. Still, enough remains to see familiar shapes. Kingship descends, cities are named, a divine decision is made. Zi-ud-sura receives a warning. A huge boat is tossed by wind and water. The storm lasts 7 days and 7 nights. The sun god Utu shines into the boat. Zi-ud-sura sacrifices. The fragments matter because they remind us that flood tradition was not born fully formed in one famous text. It was part of a larger scribal and mythic world, retold across languages and centuries. Then comes Gilgamesh. The flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh is not the whole epic. It is a story within a story. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, has been shattered by the death of his companion Enkidu. Grief drives him to seek immortality. He travels beyond ordinary human limits to find Utnapishtim, the ancient flood survivor who was granted a kind of deathless existence. When Utnapishtim tells his story, the flood becomes part of a meditation on mortality. The structure is brilliant. Gilgamesh wants to escape death. He meets the one human being who survived the great destruction and received extraordinary status. But the lesson he receives is not a simple method for becoming immortal. The flood story becomes a mirror for human limits. In Tablet 11, the gods decide to send the flood. Ea warns Utnapishtim. The boat is built. Family, craftsmen, and animals are brought aboard. The storm comes with terrifying force. After the waters recede, birds are released. Sacrifice is offered. The survivor is set apart. The overlap with Genesis is obvious enough that 19th century readers were shocked by it. But the differences matter just as much. In Gilgamesh, the flood memory is embedded inside the hero's failed quest to conquer death. It is not only a story about divine judgment, it is also a story about why Gilgamesh cannot have what Utnapishtim has. The flood survivor's exception proves the rule. Ordinary human beings die. That is where the clay tablet becomes so powerful. The artifact is real. The scribal tradition is real. The library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh is real. The cuneiform signs on the tablet are not legend. They are historical evidence that ancient Mesopotamian flood stories were being copied, preserved, and studied centuries before many later manuscript traditions reached us. But tablets are not the same thing as proof of a global flood. They are proof of stories, and stories are historical evidence of another kind. They tell us what ancient writers remembered, feared, valued, and reshaped. The Great Flood Before Noah, Mesopotamia, Memory and Myth, Part 2. When we turn from Mesopotamia to Genesis, the responsible approach is neither sensational nor dismissive. It is not careful to say, Genesis is just stolen from Gilgamesh. That is too crude for the evidence. too dismissive of religious tradition, and too simple for the way ancient literature actually works. It is also not careful to ignore the older Mesopotamian material, as if the similarities were meaningless. The better statement is this: Genesis enters an older Near Eastern conversation about flood, judgment, survival, and the ordering of life after catastrophe, and it transforms inherited motifs into its own theological argument. The shared elements are striking. A divine decision is made. One righteous or favored survivor is warned. A vessel is built. Family and animals are preserved. Waters overwhelm the world of the story. The vessel comes to rest. Birds help mark the return of dry land in some versions. Sacrifice follows. A new arrangement between the divine and human world emerges. Those parallels are real, but each tradition gives them different meaning. In Atra-hasis, the problem begins with divine labor and human noise. The flood becomes part of a crisis in the management of created life. In Gilgamesh, the flood is folded into a story about grief and mortality. In Genesis, the flood is tied to human violence, corruption, divine judgment, righteousness, and covenant. The story becomes moral and theological in a distinctive way. That difference matters. A motif can be inherited and transformed. A story can echo older material and still say something new. Ancient scribes did not live in isolated boxes. Mesopotamian stories moved. They were copied, translated, adapted, and remembered across empires. Exile, trade, conquest, education, and scribal culture all created routes through which stories and images could travel. The flood tradition is part of that larger world of contact. But contact does not mean sameness. The biblical Noah is not simply Utnapishtim with a different name. Utnapishtim is not simply Atra-hasis in another costume. Zi-ud-sura is not a rough draft waiting for later traditions to perfect him. Each survivor belongs to a different literary and religious setting. That is what makes the topic worth treating slowly. If the goal were only to prove one text older than another, we could stop with a chart. But the deeper story is about how human communities used flood memory to ask different questions. Why are humans here? Why do gods or God judge? Can life continue after catastrophe? What obligations survive the waters? What is remembered and what is changed when the story is told again? Archaeology helps us in this episode, but not in the way fringe claims often suggest. The strongest evidence is not a modern claim to have found a boat on a mountain, it is the tablets. The cuneiform tradition gives us real artifacts, real scribal contexts, real texts copied in ancient cities. A clay fragment from Nineveh can show that a Babylonian flood story circulated in a royal library. A museum object connected to Atra-hasis can show that flood narrative was preserved in Akkadian across time. These are historical anchors. They do not prove a single worldwide flood. They do not identify the ark. They do not collapse every flood myth on Earth into one event. But they do show that ancient Near Eastern flood stories were old, complex, and deeply meaningful. There may have been real floods behind some of the memory. In a river landscape like southern Mesopotamia, local floods could be devastating. The Tigris and Euphrates shaped imagination because they shaped life. A flood did not need to cover the planet to feel world-ending to a community whose fields, homes, temples, and dead lay under the same water. But the honest phrasing is cautious. Local disasters may have helped make flood traditions believable and emotionally powerful. They may have left memories that stories enlarged, but no single local flood has been proven as the one clean origin of all these narratives. Myth and history overlap here in clay, water, and retelling. The clay is historical: tablets, museums, inscriptions, scribes. The water is environmental: rivers, canals, irrigation, danger. The retelling is literary and religious, each culture reshaping catastrophe into meaning. That is why the title Before Noah should not be heard as an attempt to replace Noah. It is an invitation to look at the older world around the story, a world where flood narratives were already doing important work before the Genesis version took the shape many readers know today. The Mesopotamian flood stories are not modern science. They are not geology papers. They are not newspaper reports from the 3rd millennium BCE, but they preserve something just as human: the fear that civilization is fragile, the hope that warning might come in time, the image of life carried through water in a vessel, the need to explain why the world continues after it nearly ended. Think again of the British Museum tablet. A broken object, a fragment from a ruined library, becomes a bridge between worlds. On one side, ancient scribes copying a story of Utnapishtim. On another, Victorian scholars realizing that the Bible existed in conversation with a much older Near Eastern textual world. On another, modern viewers standing in front of clay, seeing that legend and history are not enemies. Sometimes history is the clay that preserves the legend, and sometimes the legend preserves a truth that is not simple fact. Flood stories endure because water is double. It creates and destroys. It irrigates fields and erases boundaries. It carries boats and buries cities. It cleanses, threatens, renews, and remembers nothing. Human beings standing beside rivers had to give water meaning because their lives depended on it. In Atra-hasis, water is the instrument of divine crisis. In the Sumerian fragments, water is a storm through which a survivor passes, while the broken tablet itself reminds us how much has been lost. In Gilgamesh, water becomes part of the king's encounter with mortality. In Genesis, water becomes judgment and covenant, destruction and promise. The similarities show relationship, the differences show transformation. That is the heart of the episode. The Great Flood before Noah is not one story replacing another. It is a deep background of Mesopotamian memory, a tradition of rivers and tablets, gods and warnings, boats and birds, death and survival that helps us understand why the biblical story could speak so powerfully in its own form. A flood is one of the simplest disasters to imagine and one of the hardest to survive. It comes from above and below. It erases paths. It makes land unfamiliar. It turns the known world into surface and depth. When the waters fall, the survivor does not return to the same earth. Survival itself becomes a kind of exile. That may be why these stories so often end with offerings, promises, limits, or new arrangements. After the flood, life cannot simply resume. It has to be refounded. The boat is not only a vehicle, it is a temporary world. The survivor is not only lucky, he becomes a carrier of memory. The birds are not only details, they are the first signs that the world is becoming readable again. The sacrifice is not only ritual, it is communication after silence. And the tablet is not only an artifact, it is the survival of a survival story. Where myth and history overlap, truth gets exaggerated into legend. In these flood traditions, the truth is not that all cultures recorded one identical global event in the same way. The truth is that human beings have always known water can take everything. They have always feared that order might fail. They have always imagined that wisdom might survive if someone listened in time. Before Noah, there was Atra-hasis. Before Atra-hasis, there were older fragments and river memories. After them all, there are readers still trying to understand why the waters keep returning. The flood story survives because it asks a question every civilization understands. If the world we know were washed away, what would we carry with us? And when the waters finally fell, what kind of world would we build from what remained?